There is a note that Gene Tierney wrote in the spring of 1958. It was found in her apartment in New York by her housekeeper on a Tuesday morning. The housekeeper had come to clean, as she came every Tuesday, and had let herself in with the key that Gene Tierney had given her, and had moved through the apartment in the way of a person doing the thing they do every week, and had found the note on the kitchen counter, folded once, with no name on the outside. The housekeeper read it. The note was brief, 3 sentences. The housekeeper set it down and called Gene Tierney's sister, Pat, whose number was on the list of emergency contacts that Gene had given her when she first started working for her. Pat came to the apartment. She read the note. She made a second call. Gene Tierney was not in the apartment. She was not anywhere that Pat could immediately locate. She had been, as far as anyone could establish, alone in the apartment on the Monday evening, and she was not there on the Tuesday morning. And the note said what the note said, and what the note said told everyone who read it exactly what had happened. She had left, not on a trip, not to see friends, not in any of the ordinary ways that people leave apartments for periods of time that have explanations. She had left in the way that a person leaves when they have decided that the place they are leaving is not somewhere they intend to return to. She was 47 years old. She had been one of the most celebrated film actresses in the world. She had been nominated for the Academy Award. She had made Laura and Leave Her to Heaven and The Ghost and Mrs. Muir and The Razor's Edge. She had a face that the camera had loved with the specific, total love that the camera reserves for the very few faces it encounters that are not simply beautiful, but are beautiful in the way that the camera needs. The kind of beauty that gives the lens something to do, that contains within it the suggestion of interior life, that makes the audience feel that watching the face is not simply watching a surface, but approaching something. She had also been, for the better part of 15 years, in a state of psychological suffering that the public version of her career had made invisible, and that the note on the kitchen counter was, in its 3 sentences, bringing into the visible world for the first time in a way that nobody around her could manage away. 3 days after the housekeeper found the note, they found Gene Tierney. Tonight, my friend, I want to tell you the whole story. Not only the story of the note and the 3 days and where they found her and what had led to the finding. The full story. The story of who Gene Tierney was before the films and what the films cost her and what happened to her daughter and what the industry did with that and what the 15 years between the daughter and the note contained and what a person is left with when they have been through what she had been through and the world has not noticed because the world was watching the face. Come with me. We are going back to Brooklyn, New York, in the year 1920, to a family that was wealthy in the specific way of East Coast wealth in the early 20th century. Not the inherited wealth of the old families, but the earned wealth of a man who had built something and who was now in the position of providing for his family at a level that included the specific accessories of upper-middle-class New York life in the 1920s. The good schools, the summer houses, the particular social world of people who have arrived at prosperity and who are now in the business of maintaining the appearance of having always been there. Jean Eliza Tierney was born on the 19th of November, 1920, in Brooklyn, New York. Her father was Howard Sherwood Tierney, an insurance broker of considerable success and considerable personal force who had built his business from nothing and who had the specific quality of driven, self-made men. Confident, demanding, organized around his own judgment in a way that the people closest to him experienced as authority and the people further away experienced as charm. Her mother was Belle Lavinia Taylor Tierney, a woman of social ambitions and personal beauty who was, in the specific way of wives of powerful men in that era and that social world, both central to the family's functioning and somewhat secondary to its public presentation. The family was comfortable. The childhood was comfortable in the way of comfortable families, privileged in its material circumstances, complicated in its emotional ones, organized around the father's expectations in ways that the children experienced as the permanent background condition of their existence. She was educated in Switzerland. She went to the Brillantamont International School in Lausanne, which was the kind of school that East Coast families of her parents' wealth and social aspiration sent their daughters to in the 1930s, finishing school in the European sense, where the girls received the education in languages and culture and social accomplishment that was considered the appropriate preparation for the lives they were expected to lead, which were lives organized around marriage to appropriate men rather than around professional achievement. She came back from Switzerland in 1938. She was 17 years old. She had the face that the face already was by then, the extraordinary bone structure, the green eyes, the quality of physical beauty that photographs from her adolescence confirm was fully present before any camera or any studio had touched or managed or processed it. She had the face, and she had no particular plan for what to do with it, beyond the expectation of the appropriate life that the schooling in Switzerland had been designed to prepare her for. Her father took her to Hollywood. This is the biographical detail that the standard accounts tend to present as the beginning of the story, but which is actually the middle of a story that begins earlier, with the specific dynamics of the Tierney family, the father's ambitions, the daughter's beauty, the specific calculation of a man who understood value and who recognized in his daughter's face a form of value that the entertainment industry might be persuaded to compensate. Howard Tierney arranged meetings with the studios. He negotiated with the studios on his daughter's behalf, in the way of a man who is accustomed to negotiating and who has the specific confidence of someone who knows the value of what he is offering. The studios were not immediately unanimous in their response, because the studios were accustomed to evaluating what was offered to them through the screen test rather than through the father's assessment, and the screen tests were the industry's version of due diligence. The screen tests confirmed what the father had assessed. Columbia Pictures offered a contract. Gene Tierney, who had not particularly planned any of this and who was in the process of being guided through the beginning of a career by the same man who had guided everything else in her life to that point, accepted the terms and began the work. The early films were not the films she is remembered for. She appeared in several productions in 1941 that were competent rather than significant, that required from her the qualities that the camera had confirmed she possessed without requiring anything else. She was present. She was beautiful. She was, in those early films, the thing that the studio needed her to be and not yet the thing that the finest material would allow her to become. And then, in 1944, Otto Preminger directed Laura. The film was based on a novel by Vera Caspary and was produced in circumstances that included a directorial change during production. Preminger replaced Ruben Mamoulian during the making of the film. And that produced, despite or possibly because of those circumstances, one of the finest American films of the 1940s. The film is a mystery about the apparent murder of a young advertising executive named Laura Hunt, investigated by a detective who falls in love with the dead woman through her portrait and her possessions, and then discovers that she is not dead. Gene Tierney played Laura. The role required from her a quality of presence that was different from the presence the early films had asked for. Not simply beauty in the visual sense, but the suggestion of interior life, the quality of a person who is interesting, for reasons that the surface contains hints of, but does not entirely disclose. It required her to be the thing that the detective falls in love with through the portrait, which means she had to give the audience, through the portrait, the sense of a person worth the falling in love, and to confirm that sense when the person appears in the flesh. She gave the film what it required. The performance is, by the judgment of most film historians who have written about it, the finest thing she ever did on screen, in the specific sense of the thing that most completely and most honestly expressed what she was capable of in the context of material worthy of that capability. The Academy Award nomination for Best Actress came the following year for Leave Her to Heaven, in which she played a different and more extreme version of the complex female character that Laura had introduced. Ellen Barrett is a woman of total, consuming, possessive love. Love that is so complete that it cannot accommodate any competing claim on the person it is directed at, that produces a jealousy of monomaniacal intensity, and that results, over the course of the film, in murder. She played it with a quality of cold, controlled intensity that was more technically demanding than Laura, and that received the Academy's recognition without receiving the award. She lost the Best Actress Oscar to Joan Crawford for Mildred Pierce. The Ghost and Mrs. Muir came in 1947, The Razor's Edge in 1946, Dragonwyck in 1946. The films came in quick succession, and they were, across their range, the evidence that what Laura had confirmed about her ability was not a single occasion, but a consistent capacity. She had married, in 1941, the fashion designer Oleg Cassini. The marriage was the marriage that her family had not entirely approved of. Cassini was not from the world that the Tierney family inhabited and had not attended the schools that the Tierney family associated with appropriateness. And the family's reservations were communicated with the directness that her father brought to the communication of his views about everything. She married him anyway, which was one of the few decisions in her life that had been made against the direction of the family's authority. The marriage produced 2 daughters. The first daughter was Daria, born in October of 1943. Daria Cassini was born deaf and severely mentally disabled. The disability was congenital, meaning it had been present from birth, meaning it was not the result of anything that happened during the pregnancy or the delivery, but of something that had entered the pregnancy from outside and had affected the developing child in ways that were irreversible. The something that had entered the pregnancy was rubella, German measles. Gene Tierney had contracted German measles during her pregnancy, and the rubella had crossed the placenta and affected Daria's development in the specific ways that rubella affecting a fetus in the first trimester of pregnancy affects development, which are ways that were not reversible and that were not going to improve significantly with time or with treatment. The specific event by which she contracted rubella is documented in her memoir, published in 1979. She attended a USO function during her pregnancy, in the specific context of the wartime entertainment obligation that celebrities were expected to fulfill. And she shook hands and signed autographs and was embraced by the people who came to the function, including a young woman who kissed her on the cheek and who, it turned out, had active rubella at the time of the kiss. The young woman told her, years later. She came to Gene Tierney at some point following the war, at a public event, and told her that she had been the person who kissed her at the USO function, and that she had had rubella at the time, and that she was sorry. Gene Tierney received this information and managed the reception of it publicly, in the moment, with the specific quality of composure that she had always brought to the management of what she felt in public. What she felt in private in the hours and days following the conversation is something she describes in the memoir in terms that are careful and that do not fully communicate the weight of it. Because the weight of it, the specific weight of understanding that your child's life had been determined by a single casual contact at a public event that you had been professionally obligated to attend, is the kind of weight that language approaches without fully reaching. Daria was placed in a care facility. She required the specific level of care that the severity of her disabilities required, and that Gene Tierney and Oleg Cassini could not provide in the context of their own home without support that the home could not generate. The placement was made with the specific combination of necessity and grief and the particular guilt that parents of children with severe disabilities carry regardless of the objective appropriateness of the placement. Because the carrying of the guilt is not responsive to the objective appropriateness, but to the interior fact of the separation She visited Daria. She continued to visit Daria throughout the years following the placement. The visits were, by her account in the memoir, the most difficult appointments of her life, requiring from her the specific quality of self-management that a parent requires when visiting a child who does not recognize them and who does not respond in the ways that a parent's love needs the child to respond in order to feel that the love is received. The marriage to Cassini ended in 1952. The ending was cumulative rather than singular, the product of years of the specific difficulty that Daria had produced in the marriage, and that the marriage had produced independently of Daria, because marriages between two strong-willed people who have married partly in defiance of family expectation tend to generate their own difficulty in addition to whatever difficulty the circumstances provide. She continued to work. She continued to make films through the late 1940s and into the 1950s with the professional commitment of a woman who had understood since the Laura years that the work was what she was able to give fully of herself to. In a life in which most of the other things she had tried to give fully of herself to had not responded in kind. The depression arrived. Not the ordinary depression of ordinary difficult circumstances, the natural response of a person under stress to the accumulation of stressors. The depression that arrived in Gene Tierney's life in the early 1950s was the clinical kind, the kind that has its own momentum independent of the circumstances that trigger it, that does not respond to the improvement of circumstances in the way that the ordinary response to stress responds. That becomes, once it has established itself, a condition of the person rather than a reaction to the events of their life. She was, by the accounts of the people closest to her in those years, in a state of psychological suffering that the professional life she was maintaining did not reflect, and that the public image of the beautiful actress with the extraordinary face was entirely unable to accommodate. She was in pain. The pain was constant, and it was not responsive to the things that the world offered as responses to pain: the work, the relationships, the social world of Hollywood that she continued to occupy in the specific way of professional obligation, even as the occupation became more difficult. She was hospitalized for the first time in 1957. The hospitalization was at the Menninger Clinic in Topeka, Kansas, which was one of the most distinguished psychiatric facilities in the United States and which provided, in the 1950s, the most advanced available treatment for the kind of serious psychiatric illness that Gene Tierney was experiencing. The treatment included electroconvulsive therapy, which was in 1957 the standard of care for severe depression that had not responded to other treatment and which was administered at the Menninger Clinic with the professionalism and the care that distinguished the facility from the ordinary institutional psychiatric care of the period. She has described the electroconvulsive therapy in the memoir. She has described it with the specific quality of someone who is trying to be honest about an experience that resists honest description. An experience that the mind that experienced it is not always capable of fully reconstructing, because ECT affects memory in ways that the subsequent decades of psychiatric research have documented, and that the patients who undergo it experience as a specific kind of loss. Not the loss of the experience itself, but the loss of the capacity to fully reconstruct it from the inside. She was discharged from the Menninger Clinic. She returned to New York. She returned to the apartment that the housekeeper came to clean every Tuesday. She was 47 years old, and she was in the specific state of a person who has been through something significant and who is in the fragile period following the significant thing. Not well, not recovered in the sense of having returned to the person they were before, but no longer in the acute crisis that the hospitalization had addressed. She wrote the note. She left it on the kitchen counter. She left the apartment. 3 days later, they found her on the ledge of a building on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. She was standing on the ledge of the 14th floor of a building on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. And she was not there because she had stepped out for fresh air. She was there because the note had said what the note had said, and the 3 days between the note and the ledge had been 3 days of the specific interior experience of a person who has decided something and is in the process of carrying out the decision. She was talked down. The specific person who talked her down was a woman who happened to be on the floor whose ledge she was standing on, who opened her window when she heard something, and who found Gene Tierney on the ledge and who began to talk to her in the way that people talk to people on ledges, not with argument, not with the logical refutation of the decision they have made, but with the specific human presence of someone who is paying attention to them and who is staying with them, and who is, by staying, making the case for the continuation of the thing they are contemplating ending. She came off the ledge. She was returned to the Menninger clinic. The hospitalization was longer this time, in the way that second hospitalizations following a serious attempt tend to be longer, because the attempt is the evidence that the first hospitalization had not produced the stability that the discharge had perhaps too optimistically suggested it had produced. She emerged from the second hospitalization into a life that was, in its external shape, recognizable as a continuation of the life she had left when she went to the Menninger clinic the first time, the apartment, the work when the work was available, the social world of the industry, to which she maintained access through the specific fact of who she had been, even as who she currently was did not always feel continuous with who she had been. The work was less available than it had been, because the industry that had employed her through the 1940s was not the industry that existed in the late 1950s and the 1960s, and the roles that the changed industry offered to actresses of her age and her type were not the roles that the 1940s had offered, and the specific quality of her recent history, the hospitalization, the ledge, the return from the ledge, was known within the industry with the thoroughness that personal information is known within a small, interconnected, professional community. She made some films. Preminger cast her again in Advise and Consent in 1962, which was a generous act of professional loyalty on Preminger's part and which confirmed that the talent had not been consumed by the years of illness, that what the camera had found in Gene Tierney in 1944 was still there in 1962 in a form that the camera could still use. The performance was good. The film was not a commercial failure. The revival of the career that the film suggested was possible did not fully materialize, because the industry's relationship to actresses with her history was the industry's relationship to actresses with her history, which was cautious in the way of institutions that are organized around risk management, and for which a performer's psychological history is a form of production risk. She married W. Howard Lee, a Texas oil executive, in 1960. The marriage was, by the accounts of the people who knew them, the most functional relationship of her adult life. A relationship with a man who was not from the industry and whose understanding of her was therefore not organized around the industry's version of who she was, and who was in a position to provide the specific kind of steady, uncomplicated presence that the years of illness had made her understand was what she most needed from a personal relationship. The marriage lasted until Lee's death in 1981. She outlived him by 11 years. Dying herself in November of 1991 at the age of 70. She was, in the years between Lee's death and her own, a person in the late stage of a life that had been more than ordinarily difficult and that had produced, in the person who had lived it, the specific quality of hard-won equanimity that is the most honest form of peace available to someone who has been through what she had been through. She published the memoir in 1979. Self-Portrait was the title. And the title was accurate in the way that the titles of honest memoirs are accurate. It was a portrait, and it was hers, and it was as honest as the telling of a life can be honest when the teller is still alive, and the people involved in the life are still alive. And the specific forms of honesty that the teller is capable of are bounded by those facts. She wrote about Daria. She wrote about the rubella and the USO function, and the woman who kissed her on the cheek and told her years later. She wrote about the depression and the hospitalizations and the electroconvulsive therapy. She wrote about the ledge, carefully, in terms that communicated what had happened without inviting the specific quality of public attention that the full account might have invited if less care had been taken. The note is not reproduced in the memoir. She does not describe its contents in specific terms. She describes the state of mind that produced it, and she describes the 3 days that followed it, and she describes the ledge and the woman who opened the window and talked to her, and she does not describe the note's specific content beyond the 3 sentences that communicated what it communicated to the people who read it. I have not seen the note. Nobody outside the people who were present in those days has seen the note, to my knowledge, because the note was a private document produced in a private crisis and received by private individuals who understood it as the private thing it was and who did not make it a public document. What the note communicated, in its 3 sentences, was what the 3 days and the ledge subsequently confirmed: that Gene Tierney, in the spring of 1958, had arrived at the specific point that the illness produces in some of the people it inhabits, which is the point at which the watt of the interior experience exceeds the capacity to continue carrying it, and the decision has been made, quietly and without announcement, to stop carrying it. She did not stop. The woman opened the window. The conversation happened. The carrying continued. And what the subsequent decades produced in the person who continued the carrying, the marriage to Lee, the memoir, the quiet Texas life, the long dying that the body arranged at the end, is the story of what survival looks like when survival is not the heroic narrative that the word survival tends to invoke, but simply the continued fact of being alive, with everything that fact requires and everything it does not resolve. I want to sit with you now, my friend, in the specific kind of reflection that Gene Tierney's story requires, which is different from the reflection that most of the stories we have spent time with require. Because her story is not primarily a story about Hollywood's treatment of a vulnerable person, though Hollywood's treatment of her in the years of her illness was the treatment of an institution that was organized around commercial utility, and that found the illness commercially inconvenient and managed it accordingly. It is not primarily a story about the marriage or the divorce or the professional trajectory. It is not primarily a story about the note or the ledge or the woman who opened the window, though those are the events that the title points toward and that the story required me to describe. It is primarily a story about what it costs to be a person in the full sense, to feel what needs to be felt, to carry what needs to be carried, to maintain the interior life in the specific conditions of a public existence that is organized primarily around the exterior self, over the course of a life that was as full and as difficult as hers was. She had the most extraordinary face of her generation in American cinema. The camera loved it with the complete, unreserved love that the camera extends to the very few faces it encounters that contain both the visual beauty and the suggestion of interior life. She gave the camera what the camera needed. She gave the audience the performances that the films required. She gave the industry 50 years, between her first film and her last, of professional quality that the industry's treatment of her in the years of her illness did not deserve. And, underneath all of it, for 15 years between Daria and the note, and for the decades that followed the note, she was carrying the specific weight that the illness requires of the people who carry it. The weight of a condition that does not respond to the improvement of circumstances, that does not go away when the films are good and the awards come and the public loves the face. That is simply there, in the interior room, requiring everything the person has, and sometimes requiring more than the person has. She survived, not because the surviving was simple or because the conditions that made the surviving necessary were resolved, because the woman opened the window, because the conversation happened, because in the specific and irreducible mystery of why some people come off the ledge and some do not, she came off the ledge. The note said what it said. The 3 days happened. She came off the ledge, and she lived 33 more years, and wrote the memoir, and married Lee, and outlived him, and died in her own time in November of 1991 at the age of 70. The note is gone now, probably. Or it is somewhere private and will stay there. The 3 sentences that the housekeeper read on a Tuesday morning in 1958 are not available to us. And the not availability of them is, I think, appropriate. They were not written for us. They were written in the specific crisis of a specific moment by a person who was in more pain than most of us will ever be asked to manage. And they communicated what they communicated to the people who needed to receive them. The rest is hers. Sleep well, my friend. And the next time you see that face, in Laura, in Leave Her to Heaven, in The Ghost and Mrs. Muir, in any of the films where the camera did what the camera does with it, which is to find in it the thing that makes the audience feel that they are watching something worth watching. See what the face is carrying. It was always carrying something. She never stopped carrying it. And she carried it, in the end, long enough to write the book that told the truth about it. That was enough.